I was about to tell my husband I'd inherited $35 million when the notary stopped me. Ma'am, our records show your divorce was finalized 2 months ago. I froze for 5 seconds. Then I made my move. There were no divorce papers anywhere in my memory. Not one signature I could place, not one conversation that led there. My husband handled the accounts, the filings, the parts of our marriage that lived in folders and spreadsheets. I handled the parts that lived in the actual house, the dinners, the small talk, the version of us that felt until that morning completely intact. So when the notary sat across from me reading a case number off a screen, I genuinely thought she had the wrong file pulled up. I even said so. There's been some kind of mix-up, I told her, half laughing, because the alternative hadn't occurred to me yet as something that could be true. She didn't laugh. She turned the monitor so I could see it myself. My name, my husband's name, a finalized decree, a date that meant something to me the second I saw it because it fell during the exact week my father was admitted to the ICU, the week I barely remember except in fragments. Waiting rooms, vending machine coffee, a folder of papers my husband brought to the hospital and asked me to sign because the accountant needed them before end of quarter. I signed everywhere he pointed. I didn't read a word of it. I was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep across 3 days, and he knew that better than anyone because he was the one sitting beside me holding my hand through it. I sat in that notary's office with my own signature staring back at me under a line that read petitioner, and it wasn't my name next to that word. It was his. He hadn't just let this happen. He had filed it. I asked for a minute. She stepped out, kind enough to give me the space, and I sat there in a folding chair doing math I didn't want to do. How many weeks was 2 months, and how many dinners had I made in that time? How many nights had I asked him how his day went, not knowing I was asking a man who had already legally stopped being my husband? I didn't cry. That surprised me more than anything else that morning. I just went very still, the way you do right before you decide something, and when I stood up, I already knew I wasn't going home to ask him about it. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly how much I didn't know. I drove home without turning on the radio, which is a small detail, but it's the one I remember most clearly. The silence of that drive. 20 minutes of highway, and I didn't cry once. I kept running the same loop. Accountant, end of quarter, funding round. I trusted him. I always trusted him. And none of it landed anywhere close to divorce decree. I didn't go inside when I got home. I sat in the driveway and called my sister instead. She's been a paralegal for 11 years, family law mostly, and she picked up on the second ring already asking what was wrong because apparently my voice gave it away before I said a word. I told her everything, out of order, the way you do when you're still assembling it yourself. The notary, the screen, the date. She went quiet for a second and then said the thing that actually scared me. Pull the case number. I'll look at the filing tonight. She called back 2 hours later. I still hadn't gone inside the house. She'd found the public filing. The address listed for my husband wasn't our house. It was a condo across town, in a waterfront building I'd never once heard him mention, not in 6 years of marriage, not in a single conversation about weekend plans or errands or anything at all. I looked it up myself before I even walked through my own front door, found the building's leasing page first, then a resident directory that wasn't supposed to be public but was, then eventually a name, a woman, younger than me by a decade at least. Her social media wasn't locked down the way it should have been if anyone involved had been careful, and it didn't take long to find photos. A restaurant I recognized immediately because it was the place my husband and I used to go for our anniversary, the same corner table, the same view of the water. One photo was dated 3 weeks earlier, his hand on her stomach, a small blue heart in the caption. I sat in my car in my own driveway looking at a stranger's pregnancy announcement featuring my husband's hand, and I still hadn't gone inside. I remember thinking very clearly that if I walked in right now and asked him about any of this, he would have an explanation ready. He always had an explanation ready. That was, I realized sitting there, one of the things about him I'd never actually examined, how smoothly ready he always was. So I didn't go in and ask. I called my father's estate attorney instead, because something underneath the shock of it all was already telling me the money mattered more right now than the confrontation did, and I needed to understand what a finalized divorce, filed in secret, actually did to an inheritance that hadn't transferred yet. My father's attorney picked up on a Saturday evening, which tells you something about how she'd handled the estate the whole way through. She'd given me her cell number the day of the funeral and told me to use it whenever, day or night, and I finally understood why she'd said it that way. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. Then she asked me to send her the case number, and I could hear her typing while we were still on the phone. My father, it turned out, had been more careful than I ever gave him credit for while he was alive. The inheritance had a clause in it, standard in estates this size, she said, but not something either of us had ever discussed, that excluded a spouse entirely if the marriage had legally ended before the transfer date, not separated, not filed, ended, finalized. My husband's own paperwork, filed in total secrecy, filed while I sat beside my dying father's hospital bed signing whatever was put in front of me, had already locked him out of every single dollar he might have been counting on. He had beaten himself. He simply didn't know it yet. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up. There was a version of that Saturday night where I felt something like relief, and there was another version where all I felt was the size of what he'd done. Planning this, filing this, building an entire second life across town, all while I thought grief was the only thing happening to me. I didn't confront him that night. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't composure, not really. It was that some old instinct, the same one that had kept me steady through years of fertility treatments and failed rounds and disappointment after disappointment, told me not to hand him the advantage of my shock. If he'd built all of this in secret, I wasn't going to unravel it out loud in our kitchen where he could watch my face and adjust his story in real time. So I made a decision that night that I still think was the right one. Question questions could wait. I was going to spend however long it took gathering every answer myself first, quietly, so that by the time I did sit across from him, there would be nothing left for him to explain away. I called a forensic accountant the next morning, then a private investigator, then, 2 days after that, a divorce attorney of my own, because apparently I needed one whether I'd agreed to any of this or not. The investigator called me back within a week, which felt fast until I understood how little effort my husband had put into hiding any of it. He hadn't expected to get caught. That much was obvious from how sloppy the trail was once someone actually started pulling on it. He'd been living at the waterfront condo for at least 8 months, based on utility records, and a neighbor who was more than happy to talk once the investigator started asking casual questions in the building's lobby. The neighbors believed he was married to the woman living there, not dating, married. They'd apparently hosted a small dinner party for the building's residents a few months earlier, and my husband had introduced her as his wife without a flicker of hesitation. There was a child, a little boy, maybe 2 years old, and the investigator's report used the phrase that stopped me cold when I read it. Observed calling the subject Dad in the lobby on 2 separate occasions. I read that line probably a dozen times. I want to explain what that did to me, because the divorce and the condo and even the affair, as awful as all of it was, still lived in a category of pain I understood. Betrayal, deception, things people survive. But this was different. This was a man building an entire family, a home, a routine, a child who called him dad. In the same stretch of months where I was lying on an exam table for the 4th round of a fertility treatment he'd sat beside me for, holding my hand, telling me we'd get through it together. I had spent years grieving a family that never came. He had already built one, just not with me. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept the report in a drawer I didn't open in front of him, and every night I went home and made dinner and asked about his day and listened to him lie to me in real time about a business trip, a late meeting, a work dinner, knowing now exactly where he'd actually been. The forensic accountant's first update came in around the same time, and it redirected some of my grief into something sharper. There was money moving in patterns that didn't match anything in our actual business. Shell companies, invoices for consulting work that had never happened. It was going to take longer to trace fully, she said, but the early numbers were already troubling. I told her to keep going. I told the investigator to keep going. And I kept setting 2 plates for dinner every night across from a man I now understood I had never fully known. The forensic accountant's full report landed 3 weeks later, and by then I'd stopped being surprised by anything, or so I thought. The company my husband and I built together, the one we started in a cramped apartment with unreliable internet and secondhand furniture, the one we'd sacrificed years of weekends and vacations and sleep to grow, had been quietly bleeding money for close to 2 years. Not in some abstract, hard-to-trace way, through fake consulting invoices paid out to shell companies that, when the accountant pulled the incorporation records, traced back to a name I now recognized from the condo's leasing paperwork. Her brother, her cousin, a company that existed on paper and nowhere else, billing us for strategy consulting no one had ever provided. The number, once it was all added up, was well past $400,000. I sat with the report spread across my kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten breakfast that morning, complained about traffic, kissed me on his way out the door, and did the math on what that money had actually paid for. The condo's down payment, a vacation I found photos of, a beach somewhere warm, time-stamped for a week he'd told me he was at a conference in Denver, furniture, clothes, a life running in parallel to mine, funded by a company I had also poured 6 years of my life into. Every late night I'd covered for him at work, every deadline I'd absorbed so he could handle the investor side of things, every ounce of trust I'd extended because we were partners in the business and in the marriage. All of it had been quietly rerouted into building someone else's happiness. I called the investigator again that same afternoon and asked her to confirm the timeline against the fertility treatments. I wanted to know, and I recognize how much this probably says about where my head was by then, exactly which of our lowest moments had overlapped with his highest ones. She came back with dates 2 days later. The beach vacation had landed 9 days after my second miscarriage. He'd told me he needed the trip for his sanity, for both of us really, except he'd gone alone. To her, I didn't confront him, not yet. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that piece of paper and understanding, maybe for the first time all the way through, that composure wasn't the same thing as weakness. I wasn't staying quiet because I was scared of him. I was staying quiet because I was building something, piece by piece, that he had no idea existed yet. By the 4th week, what had started as one investigator and one accountant had turned into something closer to a small team. My divorce attorney brought in a colleague who specialized in corporate fraud. The forensic accountant looped in a cybersecurity consultant once she found evidence that some of the shell company invoices had been submitted through internal system access that only a handful of people in the company had, and my husband was one of them. I hadn't told a single person at the company anything yet. That was deliberate. He still believed, every single day, that he was the only one holding a piece that mattered. There was an investor presentation scheduled for the following month, one we'd been preparing for nearly the company's entire existence. The kind of meeting that could set the trajectory for the next 5 years. New funding, an expanded engineering team, everything we'd built the company toward. My husband had taken the lead on the technical demonstration piece the way he always did, because he understood the back-end architecture better than anyone else on the team, including me. I remember sitting in a planning meeting with him 2 weeks before it, watching him walk investors through a slide deck with total confidence, the same confidence he'd used to hand me hospital paperwork and call it a funding round, and thinking, you have no idea what's coming. The cybersecurity consultant flagged something during that same week that changed the shape of everything. Buried in the system's access logs was a set of administrative credentials, his, that had been used months earlier to install what could only be described as a kill switch, a hidden function that, if triggered, would corrupt the live demonstration environment entirely, nothing else. Just that one system, timed to fail exactly when it would be most visible, most humiliating, most damaging. I asked the consultant why anyone would build something like that into their own company's systems. She said, in her experience, people don't build fail-safes for emergencies. They build them for leverage, something to hold over someone in case things ever turned against them. He'd built himself an insurance policy against the exact scenario he was currently living inside of, just in case I ever found out, just in case I ever tried to move against him. I told her to leave it in place, untouched, exactly as she found it. And then I asked her how quickly she could quietly revoke every credential he had, replace every backup system, and make sure that whatever he thought he still controlled, he no longer did, all without him noticing a single change before the day it mattered. I confronted him 5 weeks after the notary's office on a Tuesday night, after the credentials had already been quietly revoked and the backups already secured, though he had no way of knowing that yet. I asked him plainly whether he was still paying for a condo across town. I watched his face for the half-second of calculation I now recognized as his tell, the same look he probably wore the day he handed me divorce papers disguised as funding documents. He didn't deny a single word of it. That, more than anything, is what I remember most clearly. How little effort he made to lie once he realized I already knew. He told me I'd been distant since the miscarriages, said he needed someone who could give him what I couldn't. He said it flatly, almost rehearsed, like he'd practiced the sentence in a mirror somewhere, in a condo I paid for without knowing it. I asked him when he filed the divorce. He named the date without hesitation, the same date I already had memorized, 2 weeks before my father passed, the week I was sleeping in a hospital chair and he was bringing me coffee I'd mistaken, all this time, for kindness. I asked him if he loved her. He said yes. He said it like it settled something, like loving someone else was supposed to explain away a small fortune in shell company invoices and a hidden kill switch built into our own company's systems. Then he did the thing I'd been waiting to see if he would do. He told me that if I tried to expose any of this publicly, he would make sure the company burned along with it. Said too many employees depended on the company for me to risk it. Said I wouldn't have the stomach to blow it all up just to hurt him. He believed, right up until that moment, that he still had leverage, that the kill switch buried in our systems was still his, still armed, still capable of destroying an investor presentation in front of the people whose funding the company's future depended on. I told him very calmly that the presentation was in 2 days. I told him I hoped he was ready for it. I don't think he understood, standing in our kitchen looking almost satisfied with himself, that he was no longer holding any card at all. Every password had already been changed. Every backup had already been secured. Every piece of what he'd built to protect himself had already been quietly dismantled, one credential at a time, by people he didn't know existed. He thought he'd won that conversation. I let him think it. The investor presentation happened exactly as scheduled. I watched him walk into the conference room that morning with the same practiced confidence I'd seen 100 times before, greeting people, shaking hands, adjusting his cuffs before he stepped up to the podium like a man who believed he was still in control of every system in the building. He waited until roughly 10 minutes into the technical demonstration. I watched him glance toward his laptop, then type something quickly, subtly, the kind of motion you wouldn't notice unless you already knew exactly what to look for. I knew. I'd been told precisely when he would likely try it, probably right after the investors had seen enough to be impressed. Time to make the failure feel like it undid everything they'd just watched. Nothing happened. His face, for just a moment, showed something I hadn't seen on him before. Confusion. Then something closer to fear. He tried again. Still nothing. The demonstration continued flawlessly, because every credential he'd used to build his failsafe had already been quietly revoked weeks earlier. Every backup already secured. Every access point already sealed by people working for me while he still believed the systems belonged to him. That was when I stood up in front of the investors, the board, and my own husband and said I had something additional to share before we moved to questions. I laid it out clearly and without raising my voice once. The shell companies, the $400,000 in fabricated invoices, the hidden kill switch installed using his own administrative credentials, discovered and disabled weeks earlier. I didn't mention the condo, or the woman, or the child who called him dad. That part wasn't for this room. This room got the fraud, documented and airtight, presented with the same calm I'd been rehearsing in my head every night since the notary's office. The police were already waiting outside, coordinated in advance with counsel, and they walked in as I was finishing. I watched investors who had 10 minutes earlier been nodding along to his technical explanations, now watching him get read his rights in the same room. He looked at me once before they let him out. I don't know what he expected to see on my face. I don't think I gave him anything at all. The company survived the day. Barely, but it survived. And within a week, most of the original investor group had recommitted, impressed, several of them told me later, by how the company had handled a crisis instead of by anything in the original slide deck. I lost a husband that week. If I'm honest, it didn't feel like losing anything at all. It felt more than anything like finally setting something down I'd been carrying for far longer than I'd let myself admit. The weeks after the arrest moved faster than I expected them to, in the practical sense, and much slower in every other sense. There were depositions. There was a criminal case running alongside the divorce, which, as it turned out, barely needed litigating at all. He'd already filed it himself months earlier in secret, and every asset clause my father's attorney had built into the inheritance held exactly as intended. The $35 million transferred without him having any legal claim to a cent of it. I want to say that felt like victory. Mostly it just felt like paperwork. paperwork. The actual weight of those months lived somewhere else entirely. The company stabilized faster than the board had dared hope. New leadership structure, new financial oversight, a level of transparency with the remaining investors that, if I'm honest, probably should have existed the whole time. I put in long days rebuilding what the fraud had chipped away at, $400,000 of it, and there was a strange comfort in work that had clear, solvable problems, unlike everything else in my life that month. What I didn't expect was how much the child kept surfacing in my thoughts. Not the woman, not even the affair itself, which had by then hardened into more of a fact than an open wound. The little boy. The investigator's line kept coming back to me at odd hours, observed calling the subject Dad, and I found myself doing something I couldn't fully explain even to myself. I looked him up. Not the investigator's report this time, just me, alone, scrolling through the woman's social media at 11 at night, the kind of scrolling where you know you should close the laptop and don't. There were more photos than I remembered seeing the first time. A birthday party, a first day of daycare, and in almost none of them did the boy look anything like my husband. I told myself that meant nothing. Kids change. Kids don't always resemble either parent early on. I'd read that somewhere during the years we spent trying so hard to have one of our own, but I kept scrolling, and somewhere around midnight, staring at a photo of the three of them at what looked like a lake house, something small and specific caught in my chest that I couldn't quite name yet and wouldn't be able to name for another few weeks. She reached out to me directly about 6 weeks after the arrest. I hadn't expected that, and I almost didn't respond at all. Every instinct I had said this could only be an attempt to defend him, or worse, to ask me for something. It wasn't either of those things. The message was short. She said she knew I probably hated her, and that she wouldn't blame me if I deleted it without reading further, but that she thought I deserved to hear some things directly instead of through lawyers. We met at a coffee shop neither of us had any history with, neutral ground, both of us visibly uncomfortable in a way that almost made the whole thing bearable. She looked younger in person than in the photos, and tired in a way the photos hadn't shown at all. She told me things I hadn't fully pieced together yet, that he'd told her from the very beginning that his marriage was already over in every way that mattered, that we'd been living as roommates for years, that the fertility struggles had destroyed whatever we'd once had. She said she believed him. She said she was ashamed of how long she'd believed him, especially once she found out, around the same time I did it turned out, through a very different route, that the divorce had been filed secretly and used in part as a tool against me rather than an honest ending. She told me about the shell companies too, though not by that name. She said she'd signed some paperwork her brother handled, some kind of consulting arrangement, and that she hadn't asked many questions because she trusted my husband to be handling something legitimate. I believed her, mostly. She seemed genuinely unaware of the scale of what the money had actually been. Near the end of the conversation, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned her son, said he'd been asking about Dad a lot since the arrest, asking when he'd come home, and that she didn't know what to tell a 2-year-old about any of this. I didn't say anything about what I'd been noticing in her photos. It didn't feel like the moment, and honestly, I wasn't sure yet what I was noticing at all, only that something about it had settled into the back of my mind and hadn't left. We didn't part as anything like friends, but we parted, I think, as two people who'd both been lied to by the same man in different ways for different lengths of time, and there was something almost steadying in that shared understanding, even if neither of us said it out loud. It was a small thing that finally pushed the doubt from background noise into something I couldn't ignore anymore. A few weeks after the coffee shop, she messaged me again. We'd started a strange, careful kind of correspondence by then. Nothing warm exactly, but functional. Two people navigating the same wreckage from different angles. She mentioned almost in passing that her son had a minor heart murmur the pediatrician was keeping an eye on. Nothing serious, but they'd been asked for family medical history on both sides to rule things out. She asked, since I'd been married to him for 6 years, whether I knew of any heart conditions in his family. I told her honestly that I didn't know of any, and I meant it. But answering that question made me sit with something I'd been avoiding since that lake house photo at midnight weeks earlier. I knew my husband's medical history well. 6 years of marriage, plus years of dating before that, plus the specific hyper-awareness that comes from spending your own years buried in fertility clinics, asking every possible question about genetics and family history and what might or might not be passed down. I knew his blood type. I knew his family had no cardiac history at all, going back 2 generations because it had come up during one of our own fertility consultations, in the years we were still hoping to build that family together. I looked at that lake house photo again that night, really looked the way I hadn't let myself the first time, the boy's coloring, the shape of his face. None of it, I finally let myself admit, resembled my husband in any way I could identify, and everything about it resembled someone else entirely, though I had no idea who. I sat with my laptop open long after I should have gone to bed, scrolling back through months of her posts, further than I'd let myself go before. There was a photo from his first birthday, one from a 4th of July gathering, one from what looked like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a park. I caught myself doing something I wasn't proud of, comparing the shape of his eyebrows to old photos of my husband as a child, ones I had access to only because his mother had shown me an entire album years earlier, back when we were still trying to have a child of our own, and she'd wanted to show me what he'd looked like at every age, hoping it would comfort me somehow. It hadn't, not really, not back then, but it gave me something to measure against now, and none of the measurements were landing where they should have. I thought about how strange it was to be doing this, cataloging a child's features at midnight like evidence, the way the investigator had cataloged utility records and lobby sightings months earlier. I told myself I was being paranoid. That resemblance means less than people think it does. That I had no actual standing to be running this particular audit on a boy who had done nothing except exist in the wreckage of two adults' choices. And then I'd look at the photo again, and the doubt would settle back in exactly where it had been. I didn't say any of this to her. Not yet. It felt like exactly the kind of thing that could either mean nothing, the way I'd told myself at midnight weeks earlier, or mean something I wasn't ready to hand to anyone else until I understood it myself. Instead, I called my divorce attorney the next morning and asked a question that surprised even me as I said it out loud. I asked whether, given the ongoing criminal case and the financial entanglement still being sorted, there was any legal mechanism that would let a paternity test be requested as part of the broader proceedings. She was quiet for a second, then she asked me why I wanted to know. I told her I wasn't sure yet. I just knew I needed to. My attorney called back 2 days later with an answer that was more complicated than I wanted it to be. There wasn't a clean legal path to compel a paternity test through the divorce proceedings themselves. I had no custody claim, no standing in that sense, since the child wasn't mine and never had been in any legal capacity. But the criminal case gave us an unexpected opening. The prosecution was still building out the full financial picture, and the shell companies tied to her brother were part of that picture. If there was any argument that the child's expenses, the daycare, the medical care, had been indirectly funded through the fraudulent invoices, then paternity and financial dependency could become genuinely relevant to restitution calculations. It was a narrow door, but it was a door. I sat with that information for a full day before deciding anything. Part of me kept asking what I thought I would actually gain from confirming a suspicion that, if I was wrong, would only hurt a woman who'd already been lied to as thoroughly as I had, and a little boy who had nothing to do with any of this at all. I spent most of that day drafting and deleting messages to her, trying to find language that didn't sound like an accusation dressed up as concern. Every version I wrote felt wrong in a different way. One sounded clinical, like I was treating her son as evidence rather than a child. Another sounded almost cruel, laying out my suspicion in a tone that implied certainty I didn't actually have. I closed the laptop twice that afternoon, telling myself I'd let it go. That resemblance and a heart murmur weren't enough to justify what I was about to ask of her, and both times I opened it again within the hour because the not knowing had become its own kind of unbearable. But another part of me, quieter and harder to argue with, kept returning to the same fact. My husband had built an entire second life, funded by stolen money, around a family he believed was his. If it wasn't, if the child he'd sacrificed everything for, lied for, filed a secret divorce for, installed a hidden kill switch for, wasn't biologically his at all, then I needed to understand the full shape of what he'd actually destroyed everything for, not out of cruelty, out of some need to finally see the whole picture clearly, after months of only ever getting it in pieces. I called her directly instead of going through attorneys for this part. I didn't want it to feel like an ambush delivered through paperwork. I told her, as gently as I could manage, what I suspected and why, and asked whether she would consider a voluntary test, given the restitution question the prosecution had already raised independently. She didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that I asked if she was still there. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely from the careful, apologetic tone she'd used at the coffee shop. She said there had been one other person, briefly, around the time she conceived, someone she'd never told my husband about, because she hadn't thought it mattered, because by then she'd already convinced herself the timeline worked out fine. She agreed to the test within the hour. The test itself took less than an hour. A cheek swab in a sterile little office that felt almost absurdly mundane given everything riding on it. The results, we were told, would take 5 to 7 business days. I didn't tell my husband any of this was happening. He was out on bail by then, awaiting trial, living somewhere I'd stopped tracking once the credentials and the company's security were fully secured. We hadn't spoken since the investor presentation, since the look he gave me right before the police let him out, and I found I had no particular urge to break that silence just to warn him about a test that might not even confirm what I suspected. Those 5 days were strange ones. I went to work. I sat in meetings about restructured financial oversight and pretended my attention was fully there. I had dinner with my sister twice, and both times I caught myself almost telling her what I was waiting on, and both times I stopped myself because saying it out loud felt like it would make the possibility too real before I had any confirmation either way. I thought more than once about the years I'd spent trying to build a family with a man who had apparently needed something I couldn't give him badly enough to build one in secret with someone else, and about how strange it would be, how almost unbearably strange if it turned out that family had never actually been his either. I thought about the little boy specifically, more than I expected to. Not with any resentment toward him, obviously. He was a toddler who'd done nothing but exist in the middle of adults making enormous, damaging choices around him. I thought about what it would mean for him, whichever way the results landed, whether he'd ever know any of this happened, whether he'd grow up believing a man who'd once called himself Dad in a lobby twice, according to an investigator's report I still had folded in a drawer. On the 4th day, my sister called just to check in, and I almost told her everything then. I got as far as I'm waiting on something before I stopped myself again, the same way I had at dinner twice already that week. She didn't push. She's always been good about knowing when to let a silence sit instead of filling it, and I was grateful for that more than I said out loud. That same night, I found myself pulling out the investigator's original report, the one that had been folded in a drawer since the very first week, and reading it over again slowly, all the way through this time instead of skimming for the parts that had hurt the most. There was a line near the bottom I'd skipped past before, something about the boy's daycare enrollment paperwork listing no father at all on the initial intake form. form, only added later, months after enrollment, in what the investigator's notes described as a follow-up amendment. I hadn't thought much of it the first time. Sitting with it now, 5 days into waiting on a result that might confirm exactly what that small clerical detail seemed to be hinting at, it felt less like an oversight and more like the first thread of something that had been unraveling long before I ever noticed it. On the 5th evening, my phone rang while I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd confronted my husband weeks earlier, the same table where the forensic accountant's report on stolen shell company money had once sat spread out in front of me. It was the lab. I sat down before I answered. The woman on the phone was clinical and careful in the way people are trained to be when delivering results that matter enormously to the person on the other end of the line. She confirmed my identity, confirmed the case reference number, and then read out a single line that I'd been bracing for since that midnight scroll through a stranger's photos weeks earlier, and still somehow wasn't ready to hear. The probability of paternity was excluded, 0%. The child was not, in any biological sense, my husband's son. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone long after she'd finished explaining the technical details of the report, the confidence intervals, the next steps for requesting a formal copy for the court proceedings. None of that registered the way the single sentence had. Excluded. Everything he had done rearranged itself in my head in that moment, the way a picture snaps into focus once you finally have the missing piece. The secret divorce, filed in the exact week my father lay dying, so that a fortune he assumed was coming to me could instead, eventually, somehow, be steered toward the family he was building across town. The $400,000 in stolen invoices funneled through her brother's shell companies, paying for a condo, a lake house weekend, a lifestyle he'd apparently decided he'd earned by finding someone who could give him a child. The hidden kill switch, built as insurance against the exact moment I might turn all of this against him. Every calculated, careful, patient piece of a plan he had constructed around a little boy who had never once been his in the way he believed. He had blown up his marriage, his integrity, his freedom, his entire future, for a family that had never biologically belonged to him at all. He had thrown away 6 years with me. Years of trying, of grieving, of holding my hand through losses he apparently used as justification for everything that came after, to protect and provide for a child who was, in the most literal sense possible, someone else's son. I thought about the moment in the lobby the investigator described, observed calling the subject Dad. I wondered whether my husband had known, somewhere underneath all his careful confidence, that it might not be true, and had simply decided the story he wanted was worth more to him than the facts. I didn't call him. I didn't call her either, not that night. I sat alone in my kitchen with a piece of paper's worth of information that changed nothing about what he'd already lost, and somehow changed everything about what he'd lost it for. I called her the next morning instead. I owed her that much directly, not through an attorney's letter, not through some formal notice attached to a restitution filing. She didn't cry when I told her, which surprised me. She went very quiet instead, the same kind of quiet I remembered from our first conversation at the coffee shop, and when she finally spoke, she said she'd suspected it herself, somewhere she hadn't let herself examine too closely, almost since the day he was born. She explained more about the other person then, the one she'd mentioned briefly on the phone before agreeing to the test, someone from years earlier she'd kept from my husband entirely, because by the time she realized the timing might matter, she'd already let herself believe the easier story. She asked what would happen now, to her son, to the arrangement she'd built her entire life around. I answered as truthfully as I could. I didn't fully know. The restitution question was still a matter for the prosecution and the courts, not for either of us to decide over the phone, but I told her I didn't intend to make this harder for the boy than it already was, whatever that ended up meaning practically. She thanked me for calling instead of letting her find out through paperwork. I understood exactly what that particular kindness was worth because I'd only recently learned it myself, sitting in a notary's office finding out my entire life had already ended without anyone bothering to tell me directly. We didn't talk long after that. There wasn't much left to say that either of us hadn't already said in some form, across the strange, careful correspondence we'd built out of the wreckage of the same man's choices. I hung up and sat with the quiet of my house for a long time that morning, longer than I usually allowed myself to sit with anything anymore. My attorney called that afternoon with an update on the trial date, and somewhere in the middle of the logistics she mentioned, almost as an aside, that the paternity result had already been flagged for the prosecution's restitution calculations, that it would likely come up formally once the case moved forward. I asked her, before we hung up, whether he knew yet. She said no. Nobody had told him. He was still sitting wherever he was sitting, still believing, as far as anyone could tell, that the only things he'd lost were the marriage, the money, and the freedom the arrest had already cost him. I thought about calling him myself, got as far as finding his name in my contacts, a name I hadn't dialed since the night I watched him decide, in real time, not to bother denying any of it. I put the phone down instead. Someone else would tell him eventually, in a courtroom or a filing or a call from his own attorney. It would reach him the way everything else had lately, later than it should have, and completely out of his control. I thought about the boy instead, 2 years old, still asking when Dad would come home, with no understanding yet that the answer to that question had just gotten far more complicated than a bail hearing. I thought about my father, and the clause he'd built into an inheritance I hadn't asked for and hadn't wanted under these circumstances, protecting me from a betrayal he never lived to see confirmed. And I thought about the exact 5 seconds I'd frozen in that notary's office, the moment before I made my first move, back when I still believed the worst thing happening to me that day was finding out about a secret divorce. I hadn't known yet, sitting in that chair, just how much further underneath the surface the whole thing actually went.